My next guest in the past few years has reached great heights, really. He is very well respected among performers. He has an album. He writes and performs practically all of his own material.
For 30 years, he was America's nighttime companion, the man who tucked millions into bed with laughter. But when the cameras stopped rolling and the studio lights dimmed, Johnny Carson lived a very different life. Behind that charming smile and quick wit was a man wrestling with demons most of his audience never saw. The truth about his private world, his relationships, and his struggles might just change how you remember the king of late night. This is the hidden life of Johnny Carson, and it was worse than you think. The man behind the curtain. Johnny Carson seemed born for the spotlight. From his early days in Nebraska to his reign over late-night television, he appeared effortless, natural, always in control. Every weeknight, he'd sit behind that desk, tap his pencil against his coffee mug, and make it look easy. But according to those who worked with him, the moment the commercial break hit, something changed. The Johnny Carson everyone knew simply vanished. One crew member described it as watching someone flip a switch. The instant the cameras went dark, the warmth disappeared. He'd become distant, withdrawn, almost unrecognizable from the man viewers had just been watching. Ed McMahon, his loyal sidekick for decades, once noted how Carson could be two completely different people. On camera, he was engaged, present, masterful at his craft. Off camera, he kept everyone at arm's length. Even McMahon, who shared countless hours with Carson, admitted there were walls the host never let anyone past. This duality defined much of Carson's life. He gave everything to his show, pouring his energy and talent into those 90 minutes of television. But that dedication came at a cost, one that would echo through his personal relationships for years to come. The Four Wives. Johnny Carson's romantic life read like a cautionary tale. 4 marriages, 3 divorces, and a pattern that kept repeating itself. His first marriage to Jody Wolcott began in 1949 when they were both young and hopeful. They had 3 sons together, and for a while, it seemed like a typical American family. But behind closed doors, tensions simmered. Both Johnny and Jody had affairs during their marriage, creating a volatile environment. Friends who visited the couple described uncomfortable dinners where arguments would erupt without warning. The relationship deteriorated steadily, especially as Carson's career began taking off. When Johnny landed The Tonight Show in 1962, the marriage was already crumbling. By 1963, they divorced. The split was messy, filled with resentment on both sides. Those close to the situation suggested that Carson's growing fame made it impossible for the marriage to survive, though the problems had been there long before he became a household name. Just months after his divorce from Jody, Carson married Joanne Copeland in 1963. She was a model and former Pan Am stewardess who had encouraged him to pursue the Tonight Show hosting job full-time. Their courtship had actually started back in 1960, overlapping with his first marriage. Joanne later spoke about how Johnny expected her to act as a buffer between him and his staff, taking the brunt of workplace tensions. She became caught in the middle, dealing with pressures that weren't really hers to handle. The marriage lasted 9 years, ending in a bitter divorce in 1972. Joanne walked away with a settlement of nearly $500,000 plus ongoing alimony payments. That same year, Carson married his third wife, Joanna Holland. She was a former model and one of Manhattan's highest-paid fashion faces. They met at the exclusive 21 Club in New York, while Johnny was still finalizing his divorce from Joanne. He later admitted to being immediately taken with her, describing himself as flirting like a teenager. Their relationship started with passion and promise. Johnny surprised everyone, including Joanna herself, by announcing at a party that they'd gotten married that very afternoon. It was impulsive, romantic, the kind of gesture that seemed out of character for the usually guarded host. But the marriage faced challenges from the start. When The Tonight Show moved production to California, the change put enormous strain on their relationship. Joanna and her son from a previous marriage relocated with Johnny, but the adjustment proved difficult. Reports suggest Johnny's demanding work schedule and continuing personal struggles made maintaining the relationship nearly impossible. The marriage lasted 13 years, though they separated in 1982. When Joanna filed for divorce in 1983, the proceedings dragged on for nearly 2 years. The final settlement in 1985 was staggering. Joanna received $20 million in assets, including their Bel Air mansion, multiple Manhattan apartments, luxury cars, and monthly alimony payments of $35,000. Carson handled the financial blow with his trademark humor, frequently joking about the expensive divorce on his show. But those who knew him well sensed the pain beneath the punchlines. He'd failed at marriage yet again, and the pattern was becoming impossible to ignore. In 1987, Johnny married for the fourth and final time. Alexis Moss was significantly younger than Carson, and their relationship marked a turning point. Friends and colleagues noticed something different about this marriage. Producer George Schlatter later said that Alexis was the real love of Johnny's life. This final marriage lasted until Carson's death in 2005. It was his longest relationship, spanning 18 years. Alexis seemed to provide the stability and understanding that had eluded him in previous marriages. After retiring from The Tonight Show in 1992, Johnny lived quietly with Alexis, finally finding some peace away from the spotlight. The drinking problem. One of the darkest threads running through Carson's life was his relationship with alcohol. Multiple ex-wives described a man who transformed when he drank, becoming someone they barely recognized. Joanne Copeland said Johnny became two different people under the influence. The charming, witty host would disappear, replaced by someone harsh and unpredictable. According to people close to the situation, Carson's drinking often happened behind closed doors, away from the public eye he so carefully managed. He could be pleasant and engaging at industry events, maintaining his professional persona. But at home, particularly during difficult periods in his marriages, the alcohol brought out a side of him that was frightening to witness. Jody Wolcott, his first wife, reportedly experienced Carson's drinking-fueled rages during their marriage. Friends who visited the couple sometimes witnessed uncomfortable confrontations. The pattern was there from the beginning, a warning sign of troubles that would follow Carson through multiple relationships. Joanna Holland later described what she called Johnny's black drunk phase during their marriage. She admitted to being frightened during those periods, never knowing what might set him off. The smallest thing could trigger an outburst, and the normally reserved Carson would become volatile and confrontational. His words could cut deep, targeting insecurities with surgical precision. The man who made millions laugh every night could just as easily reduce someone to tears in private. The transformation was so complete that people who witnessed both versions struggled to reconcile them. How could the controlled, professional Carson they saw on television become this unpredictable, sometimes menacing figure? But alcohol has a way of stripping away carefully maintained facades, revealing what lies beneath. One particularly ugly incident occurred at NBC's lavish 25th anniversary party for The Tonight Show in October 1987. Johnny's son Rick attended the celebration and had too much to drink. When Carson checked on him, the situation exploded into a screaming match. Right there, in front of network executives, media representatives, and family members, father and son went at each other. Witnesses said Carson was the aggressor, escalating the argument to the point where he appeared ready to throw punches at his own son. Someone had to physically intervene to prevent the confrontation from turning violent. It was a humiliating display from a man who normally kept such tight control over his public image. The incident revealed just how combustible the combination of Carson and alcohol could be, even at an event meant to celebrate his enormous success. The drinking also led to legal consequences. In 1982, while married to Joanna, Carson was arrested for driving under the influence. He pled no contest to the misdemeanor charge and received a fine of $600 plus 3 years of probation. For someone so protective of his privacy, the public nature of the arrest must have been particularly mortifying. The DUI wasn't just embarrassing, it was dangerous. Carson had put himself and others at risk, behavior that stood in stark contrast to the responsible, professional image he cultivated. The arrest became public record, something the press could and did report on. For a man who spent his career controlling his narrative, having this aspect of his private struggles exposed must have been agonizing. Friends and colleagues walked on eggshells around Carson when they suspected he'd been drinking. His temper could erupt without warning, and the verbal attacks could be cutting. He had a gift for finding exactly the right words to wound someone, and alcohol seemed to strip away whatever filter normally kept those impulses in check. People learned to read the signs, to recognize when Carson had been drinking, and to adjust their behavior accordingly. It created an atmosphere of tension and unpredictability around someone who, on screen, seemed to be the most dependable presence in American entertainment. The contrast was jarring, and, for those who experienced it, sometimes traumatic. Some who worked with Carson suggested that the drinking was his way of coping with the enormous pressure of maintaining The Tonight Show's success year after year. Others thought it stemmed from deeper issues, childhood wounds, and emotional patterns he'd never properly addressed. Whatever the root cause, the alcohol clearly made existing problems worse, amplifying his worst qualities while suppressing his better ones. The cruel streak. Even sober, Carson could display a surprisingly harsh side. His treatment of guests on The Tonight Show occasionally crossed lines that would be unacceptable today. He developed a reputation for making weight-related jokes at the expense of overweight celebrities, and he pursued these jokes relentlessly. Actor Raymond Burr, a veteran NBC performer, became a frequent target. Carson made so many jokes about Burr's weight that the actor eventually refused to appear on The Tonight Show altogether. It was a significant decision, considering the show's importance for publicity, but Burr had reached his limit with Carson's mockery. The show maintained what became known as a ban list, a roster of celebrities who were no longer welcome when Carson was hosting. Some estimates put the list at over 30 names. The reasons for these banishments varied widely, from minor offenses to more serious disputes. Jay Leno, who would eventually become Carson's successor, found himself banned after his 5th appearance in 1978. The audience response to his set was lukewarm, and Carson decided never to invite him back. The show's talent scout tried to argue for giving Leno another chance, but producer Peter LaSalle shut it down, explaining that once Johnny didn't like someone, he never changed his mind. Leno did eventually return and later hosted The Tonight Show himself, but the initial rejection must have stung. Ellen DeGeneres made history as the first female comedian invited to sit on Carson's couch after performing her set, but she also ended up banned after making a joke she'd been specifically told to avoid. Carson didn't appreciate being disobeyed, and that was that. Dana Carvey's popular Saturday Night Live impression of Carson eventually got him permanently banned. At first, Carson tolerated the parody, even having Carvey on the show multiple times, but a 1990 sketch portrayed Carson as out of touch and clueless while talking with competitor Arsenio Hall. After that aired, Carvey was done. Carson referenced the sketch during his monologue, making a self-deprecating joke about being old, but he never invited Carvey back. Even Orson Welles, whom Carson admired greatly, got banned. Welles had become a regular guest and was invited to guest host for the 5th time, but when he told Carson he planned to do a mentalist routine during his hosting stint, something about the idea bothered Johnny. Welles was never invited back again. Perhaps the most painful rupture involved Joan Rivers. She'd appeared on The Tonight Show over 100 times and frequently served as guest host. Carson mentored her career, and she considered him a dear friend. But in 1986, Rivers accepted an offer to host her own late-night talk show in direct competition with Carson. According to Rivers, she called Johnny to tell him about the opportunity before accepting it. She wanted to explain the situation personally, to make sure he heard it from her. But when she made that call, Carson hung up on her. He never spoke to her again. Not once in the nearly 20 years before his death did he acknowledge her existence. Producer Peter LaSalle later suggested Rivers handled the situation terribly. If she'd approached Carson earlier in the negotiations, expressing her temptation but seeking his blessing, he likely would have supported her decision. Instead, by waiting until she'd already made up her mind, it felt like a betrayal. Carson's public statement was brief and diplomatic, wishing her the best, but privately, he cut her out of his life completely. Rivers disputed this version of events in later interviews, maintaining that she'd tried to do the right thing, but the damage was done. Two people who'd shared a significant professional relationship and genuine friendship were permanently estranged. When Rivers died in 2014, Carson had been gone 9 years, taking any possibility of reconciliation with him. The distant father. Johnny Carson's relationship with his 3 sons was complicated and, by his own admission, insufficient. He married his work, pouring everything into The Tonight Show at the expense of family connections. His sons Christopher, Richard, and Corey grew up with a father who was physically present but emotionally distant. The pattern started early. Even when the boys were young, Carson's career ambitions took priority. He was building something, climbing the entertainment ladder, and that climb required focus and sacrifice. Unfortunately, much of that sacrifice came from his family life. The time and emotional energy that should have gone to his sons went instead to perfecting his craft, developing his television persona, advancing his career. Christopher, the eldest, learned early on that his father's attention was a scarce resource. Rick, the middle son, developed a particularly close connection to Johnny in some ways, sharing his father's sensibilities and sense of humor. Corey, the youngest, watched his brothers navigate their relationship with their often absent father and drew his own conclusions about what to expect. Richard, who went by Ricky, shared his father's sensibilities and sense of humor. Those who knew them both saw strong similarities. Ricky pursued photography, particularly nature photography, and seemed to be finding his own path. He had a real eye for composition and light, capturing beautiful images of the natural world. His work showed genuine talent, a creative gift that echoed his father's own abilities in a different medium. But Ricky also struggled with mental health issues that led to hospitalization, depression, anxiety, perhaps other conditions. The family kept the specific details private, as they kept most personal matters private. What's known is that Ricky reached a point where professional intervention became necessary, where he needed more help than family support could provide. When Ricky was committed to a mental health facility, Johnny refused to visit him. It was a choice that revealed just how uncomfortable Carson was with emotional vulnerability and family crisis. He couldn't or wouldn't engage with his son's suffering, whether it was fear, shame, inability to cope with such raw human pain, or simply not knowing what to say or do. Carson stayed away when his son needed him most. Those close to the family found this behavior difficult to understand. Here was a man who could chat with anyone on television, who could make strangers feel comfortable and seen, yet he couldn't bring himself to sit with his struggling son. The disconnect between his public warmth and private coldness had never been more stark or more consequential. On June 21, 1991, Ricky was driving along a scenic coastal route in Morro Bay, California, when his car went off the embankment, plummeting 125 feet. He died instantly at 39 years old. The tragedy shattered Johnny in ways that were visible even through his famous reserve. The news reached Carson while he was away from work, and those who saw him in the immediate aftermath described a man utterly devastated. Whatever walls he'd built to protect himself, whatever emotional distance he'd maintained, none of it helped him cope with losing his son. The grief was total and overwhelming. When Carson returned to The Tonight Show a few weeks after Ricky's death, he delivered a tribute to his son at the end of the show. It was one of the rare moments when viewers saw genuine, unguarded emotion from him. He spoke for 5 minutes, his voice breaking, clearly struggling to maintain composure. The pain was raw and evident. He talked about Ricky's talent, his perspective, the person he'd been. Some viewers found it uncomfortable to watch. They were used to Carson making them laugh, not sharing such profound sadness. But others appreciated seeing the real man behind the persona, even if the circumstances were tragic. For those few minutes, Johnny Carson wasn't a television host. He was just a father mourning his child. Producer Fred de Cordova made a critical error during that broadcast. As Carson's tribute ran long, de Cordova gave him the signal to wrap it up because they were running overtime. It was a staggeringly insensitive moment, prioritizing the show's schedule over a grieving father's need to honor his dead son. Carson never forgave him. De Cordova was banned from the studio floor for the rest of The Tonight Show's run, a dramatic severing of a long professional relationship. The ban sent a message to everyone on staff. Some things mattered more than the show's rigid structure. Ricky's memory was one of those things. Carson's grief was another. De Cordova had violated something fundamental, and there was no walking it back. During his final Tonight Show broadcasts in May 1992, Carson brought his 2 surviving sons onto the stage. Christopher and Corey stood with their father, sharing one of his last moments as host of the show that had defined his life. It was touching, but also bittersweet, given how much distance had characterized their relationships over the years. The final episode included one of Ricky's nature photographs in the closing credits. It was Johnny's way of keeping his son's memory alive, sharing Ricky's art with millions of viewers. Carson later expressed regret about his failings as a father. He acknowledged that he didn't know how to be the parent he wanted to be, that The Tonight Show consumed him in ways that left little room for family. It was an honest admission, though it came too late to repair much of the damage. You can't get those years back. Can't reclaim the moments you missed while pursuing other priorities. The loss of Ricky haunted him for the rest of his life, a grief that never fully healed. People who saw Carson in his final years said he would still tear up when Ricky's name came up in conversation. The wound remained fresh, a constant reminder of all the things he wished he'd done differently, all the time he wished he'd spent being present for his sons instead of perfecting his television show. The Ruth Carson factor. Understanding Johnny Carson's emotional distance requires looking at his childhood, particularly his relationship with his mother, Ruth. Carson himself attributed much of his personality to her influence, and not in a positive way. This wasn't speculation from outsiders or theories from psychologists. Johnny talked about it himself, in his own words, during rare moments when he let his guard down. Ruth Carson was, by multiple accounts, a cold woman. She wasn't affectionate with her children, didn't provide the warmth and emotional security that young people need. Johnny grew up in an environment where emotions weren't discussed, where vulnerability was discouraged, where keeping up appearances mattered more than authentic connection. Imagine being a child reaching for comfort and being met with coldness instead. Imagine learning early that showing your feelings leads to rejection or ridicule. Those lessons sink deep, shaping how you relate to everyone for the rest of your life. Ruth taught Johnny that love is conditional, that approval must be earned through achievement rather than given freely. The Carson household in Nebraska wasn't overtly abusive, but it was emotionally barren. Ruth ran it with efficiency and control, but without warmth. Johnny and his siblings learned to navigate her moods, to predict her reactions, to protect themselves by revealing as little as possible. It was training, though no one recognized it as such at the time. Training for a life of emotional guardedness. Friends and colleagues noticed how Carson would tense up when discussing his mother. The relationship left scars that shaped how he interacted with others throughout his life. Even decades later, even after becoming one of the most famous men in America, even after Ruth's death, Johnny couldn't fully escape her influence on his psyche. He replicated Ruth's emotional distance in his own relationships, unable or unwilling to let people get close. His wives described a man who kept parts of himself locked away, inaccessible even to those who loved him. His sons experienced a father who provided for them materially, but couldn't give them the emotional presence they needed. The pattern Ruth established continued through generations, damaging relationship after relationship. Some who knew Carson well believed he recognized the pattern, but felt powerless to break it. Awareness doesn't always lead to change, especially when the behaviors are so deeply ingrained. Johnny could intellectually understand that his emotional distance hurt people. He could acknowledge that he was repeating his mother's mistakes, but knowing something and being able to change it are entirely different challenges. This pattern affected his marriages, his friendships, and especially his connection with his sons. Johnny recognized the problem but seemed powerless to change it. The behaviors were too deeply ingrained, the protective walls too firmly established. Ruth had taught him to hide his true self, and he never fully unlearned that lesson. In therapy, which Carson apparently tried at various points, the connection between Ruth's parenting and his adult struggles would have been obvious, but understanding the source of a problem doesn't automatically provide the solution. Breaking patterns established in childhood requires sustained effort, genuine commitment to change, and often professional help over many years. For someone as private and guarded as Carson, that kind of deep therapeutic work may have felt impossible or unbearable. So the cycle continued. Johnny Carson gave the world his talent, his humor, his nightly presence. But he withheld his authentic self, his vulnerability, his heart. And at the root of that, withholding was a little boy in Nebraska who learned too early that love isn't safe, that showing weakness invites pain, that the best strategy is to keep everyone at a careful distance. Ruth Carson shaped her son in ways she probably never intended or understood. She gave him the discipline and drive that fueled his success, but she also gave him the emotional handicaps that ensured he could never fully enjoy that success or share it meaningfully with the people closest to him. The Perfectionist. Carson's dedication to The Tonight Show bordered on obsession. He demanded excellence from himself and everyone around him. Guests who told jokes that fell flat or disrupted the show's flow risked permanent banishment. Kevin Nealon and Howie Mandel both recalled making jokes that went wrong, leading to them never being invited back to Carson-hosted episodes. Actor Robert Blake compared being interviewed by Carson to facing a death squad or performing on Broadway's opening night. The pressure was immense because Carson's approval could make or break careers. A successful Tonight Show appearance launched countless comedians into stardom, but bombing on Carson's stage could be devastating. Carson had specific rules about his show. No more than 3 jokes on the same subject in the monologue. Sketches had to meet his exacting standards. Guests needed to understand the rhythm and flow he'd established. Cross those invisible lines and you were done. Charles Grodin became famous for his playful antagonism with Carson during his appearances. Grodin would challenge Johnny, questioning whether he really cared about the questions he was asking. It was a routine they both enjoyed, but it required a delicate balance. Grodin knew exactly how far he could push without crossing into territory that would genuinely anger Carson. Don Rickles had a similar dynamic, built on good-natured insults and ribbing, but Rickles was a master at reading the room and knowing when to pull back. Not everyone had that skill, and Carson's reactions to perceived disrespect could be swift and final. The charitable side. For all his flaws and struggles, Carson did have a generous streak, particularly when it came to charitable causes. He created the John W. Carson Foundation in 1981, dedicated to supporting children, education, and health services. After his death, his estate contributed over $150 million to the foundation, making it one of the largest Hollywood charities. Carson donated significantly to his hometown of Norfolk, Nebraska. He funded the Carson Cancer Center at Faith Regional Health Services, contributed to the Elkhorn Valley Museum, and established the Johnny Carson Theater at Norfolk Senior High School. He also created the Carson School of Theater and Film at the University of Nebraska, ensuring that students would have opportunities he'd once dreamed of. His favorite teacher, Miss Faye Gordon, received special recognition. Carson donated to the Northeast Community College Lifelong Learning Center in her honor and flew back to Norfolk to throw her 100th birthday party, something he'd promised years earlier. These acts of generosity showed a different side of Carson, one that genuinely wanted to make a positive impact. He could have simply accumulated wealth and lived lavishly without giving back. Instead, he chose to support causes that mattered to him, particularly education and healthcare. The final years. After retiring from The Tonight Show in 1992, Johnny Carson largely disappeared from public life. He'd spent 30 years in America's living rooms, but once he walked away, he was done. No more interviews, no more public appearances, no attempts to stay relevant. He lived quietly in Malibu with Alexis, enjoying the privacy he'd protected so fiercely throughout his career. Friends described him as content during these years, finally able to relax without the constant pressure of producing a nightly show. Carson maintained a friendship with Carl Sagan, the astronomer and science communicator. They shared a love of the cosmos, and Sagan appeared on The Tonight Show many times. Carson was the first person to contact Sagan's wife with condolences when the scientist died in 1996. It was one of the few close friendships Carson seemed to nurture in his later years. But the years of smoking finally caught up with him. Carson had been a heavy smoker for most of his life, going through more than a pack a day. He and Ed McMahon both smoked on camera in the show's early years, though they eventually stopped as health awareness increased. In 2005, Johnny Carson died from respiratory failure caused by emphysema. He was 79 years old. His death marked the end of an era, the passing of the man who defined late-night television for an entire generation. The complex legacy. Looking back at Johnny Carson's life reveals a man of contradictions. He was brilliantly funny, yet emotionally distant, generous with money but stingy with affection, a perfectionist in his work who couldn't maintain his personal relationships, beloved by millions who never really knew him at all. His Tonight Show set the template for every late-night talk show that followed. The format he established, the rhythm he perfected, the relationship with the audience he built, all of it became the blueprint. David Letterman, Jay Leno, Conan O'Brien, Jimmy Fallon, and countless others owe their careers to the path Carson carved. But the cost of that success was steep. 4 marriages, 3 ending in expensive, painful divorces, estranged relationships with his children, a drinking problem that damaged him and those around him, professional relationships that ended in permanent ruptures over perceived slights. Those who knew Carson well spoke of 2 distinct people. The public Johnny Carson was charming, quick-witted, the perfect host. The private Johnny Carson was guarded, sometimes cruel, wrestling with demons he rarely acknowledged. Most people only ever saw the first version, the carefully constructed persona he presented to the world. Ed McMahon, despite working alongside Carson for decades, admitted their friendship had limits. They'd have dinner together, share drinks, enjoy each other's company, but there were parts of Johnny that remained forever off limits. Rooms in his emotional house that no one was allowed to enter. David Letterman, who idolized Carson and followed in his footsteps, described how people wanted to end their days by being tucked in by Johnny. It was an apt metaphor. Carson was comforting, familiar, a nightly ritual that made people feel safe and entertained. But like any professional performer, he was selling an illusion. The real Johnny Carson was far more complicated than the man America thought they knew. He gave everything to his audience while struggling to give anything to the people in his actual life. He made millions laugh while battling private pain. He became an icon while remaining fundamentally alone. Johnny Carson's hidden life wasn't filled with scandalous secrets or shocking revelations. Instead, it was the story of a man unable to bridge the gap between his public persona and private self. He excelled at one while failing at the other, pouring all his energy and talent into entertaining millions at the expense of genuine human connection. His struggles with alcohol, his failed marriages, his distant relationship with his sons, these weren't unique problems. Plenty of people face similar challenges. What made Carson's situation notable was the stark contrast between the warmth he projected on screen and the coldness that characterized his personal life. The king of late night ruled his kingdom with skill and dedication, but when the cameras turned off and the audience went home, he was just a flawed man doing his best to manage demons planted in childhood and nurtured through years of fame and pressure. Understanding these complexities doesn't diminish Carson's achievements. The Tonight Show remains a landmark in television history, and his influence on comedy and entertainment is undeniable. But it does provide a more complete picture of who Johnny Carson actually was, beyond the carefully crafted image. He was brilliant and troubled, generous and withholding, beloved and lonely. He was human, with all the contradictions that implies, and perhaps that's the real lesson of his hidden life. Even our heroes, even the people who seem to have it all figured out, are fighting battles we know nothing about. Johnny Carson made us laugh for 30 years, but behind that laughter was a man who struggled to find joy in his own life, who achieved everything professionally while losing much personally. That's the truth about the king of late night, and yes, it really was worse than most people think. If you enjoyed learning about the hidden side of Johnny Carson, please hit that like button and subscribe for more deep dives into the lives of entertainment legends. Thanks for watching, and we'll see you in the next one.